One daughter is a brilliant medical professional saving lives, and the other, well, at least she has a strong back for scrubbing toilets. My mother Vivian raised her champagne glass and laughed loudly. 10 people sitting around the lavish Thanksgiving dinner table in Atlanta joined in. I just sat there gripping my wine glass. And when she opened her mouth to praise my sister Chloe again, what I said next brought the entire dining room to a dead, suffocating silence. I am Dominique, 35 years old, and I finally decided to stop paying to maintain this family and their perfect illusion. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined their Thanksgiving dinner, let me know where you are watching from, in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family and had to build an empire with your own two hands. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow across the dining room of the $3 million Buckhead mansion. My sister Chloe and her white husband Preston loved showing off this house. The massive mahogany table was covered in expensive china polished silver, and a giant roasted turkey sitting right in the middle. My mother tapped her silver knife against her crystal glass again, demanding everyone to pay attention. It was a Thursday, but she was wearing a spectacular designer dress she usually saved for Sunday church service, purely to flex her status to Aunt Denise and Pastor Thomas sitting across from me. She looked at Chloe with absolute adoration. Chloe was the golden child. She was a 33-year-old dermatologist, draped in designer silk that I knew cost more than a car payment. Then my mother slowly shifted her gaze to me. The warmth in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, familiar disdain. She told the table that God works in mysterious ways, giving one daughter a brilliant medical mind and giving the other a sturdy pair of knees to clean up the messes of better people. The laughter echoed off the freshly painted walls. Aunt Denise nearly choked on her wine trying to hold back a snicker. Pastor Thomas offered a patronizing smile and muttered something about manual labor being good for building character. My father Derek sat at the head of the table, entirely avoiding my eyes. He just stared at his mashed potatoes, pretending he did not hear the venom his wife just spat at his oldest daughter. He had always been a coward, never once standing up for me. Looking at my father and his graying hair, I suddenly felt like I was 20 years old again. I remembered standing in our old kitchen, my hands shaking as I held my acceptance letter to Howard University. I had worked so hard for it. But my father made terrible financial choices and blew a massive business loan on gambling. They were about to lose the family home. My parents sat me down and begged me to use my entire college savings to bail him out. When I asked about the college fund for Chloe, my mother looked at me like I was crazy. She said Chloe needed her tuition money for medical school because Chloe was going to be somebody important. They told me I could always go to community college later. I gave them every last dime I had saved. While Chloe partied through undergrad, joined a prestigious sorority, and breezed through anatomy classes with fully paid tuition, I was on my hands and knees. I spent my entire early 20s scrubbing toilets in affluent neighborhoods to make rent. I started my cleaning business with nothing but a cheap plastic bucket, a mop, and a broken heart. My family called me the Maid. They threw the word at me like a weapon, hoping to keep me in my place. They thought it was the ultimate insult. But what they did not know was that being a cleaner taught me everything about the world. It taught me how to clean up massive messes, including the one they were currently living in. Back at the Thanksgiving table, the mocking continued. Aunt Denise chimed in, saying it was so gracious of Chloe to let me sit at such a fancy table with educated people. Preston let out a booming laugh. He adjusted the heavy luxury watch on his wrist and leaned back in his leather dining chair. He had that baseless arrogance that comes with unchecked privilege. Preston told me I should take notes on the home decor so I could learn how successful people live. He even had the audacity to suggest that his private equity firm was doing so well that he might hire me to mop the floors of his office building. He smirked, looking around the table for validation. The sheer audacity of this man made my blood boil, but I kept my face perfectly blank. I knew secrets about Preston that could wipe that smug smile off his face forever. I knew things about this entire house that could shatter their perfect facade. For years, I stayed quiet to keep the peace. I let them belittle my business, mock my life choices, and treat me like the help. But sitting there listening to them stroke their own egos while stepping on my dignity, I realized I was done. The debt of being their daughter was finally paid in full. I looked down at my plate. The turkey looked incredibly dry and tasteless. The cranberry sauce was clearly scooped straight out of a cheap supermarket can. Everything about this lavish dinner was a cheap imitation, just like the people eating it. I did not cry. I did not flip the table and storm out like I would have when I was younger. Instead, I slowly picked up my heavy glass of red wine. I took a slow sip, letting the dark liquid coat the rim of the crystal. I gently set the glass down. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. I looked my mother dead in the eye, then slowly turned my gaze to my sister. I told Chloe that this really was a beautiful house. I said it was such a shame that the food did not match the elegance of the dining room. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady, as I added that I guess it must be hard to afford a fresh organic turkey when all of her credit cards are maxed out just trying to pay the past due electric bills. The laughter in the room died instantly. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. Aunt Denise gasped. Chloe dropped her silver fork. It clattered loudly against her expensive china plate, sending a sharp ringing sound echoing through the massive room. My mother turned a deep shade of purple, and I just sat there waiting for the real show to begin. Preston slammed his palms flat against the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently, and the silverware clinked against the expensive china. His face, which had been a relaxed pale color just moments ago, flushed into a deep, angry crimson. He pushed his heavy dining chair back with a loud screech against the hardwood floor and stood up, towering over the table. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face. "How dare you!" He spat, his voice echoing with the booming, unearned authority of a man who was used to the world handing him everything. He looked at me not just as a sister-in-law, but as someone entirely beneath him in the social order. "You march into my home, sit at my table, eat my food, and have the audacity to disrespect my wife." I did not blink. I simply leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. My calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate him more. Preston puffed out his chest, adjusting the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. "You are pathetic, Dominique. You sit there reeking of jealousy because you are staring at a life you could never achieve. This is a $3 million estate. You are sitting in a room full of highly educated, successful intellectuals. Chloe saves lives for a living. I manage millions in private equity. And what do? You wipe up dirt. You scrub baseboards for a few crumpled dollar bills. You should be down on your knees thanking us for even allowing you to step foot through the front doors of a neighborhood like this." He continued his loud tirade, pacing slightly behind Chloe's chair and placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Chloe immediately leaned into his touch, bringing a manicured hand to her chest, taking on the role of the fragile attacked victim. She let out a soft, theatrical whimper. Preston sneered at me, telling the entire table that my comments about credit cards were nothing but the delusional fantasies of a bitter woman who was deeply embarrassed by her own mediocre life. He spoke with the absolute certainty of white privilege, firmly believing that raising his voice was enough to put a black woman back in her place. As his loud voice filled the room, I let my eyes wander away from his red face. I looked past his expensive haircut and focused on the ceiling right above his head. The dining room was undeniably beautiful, with intricate crown molding and a massive plaster medallion surrounding the crystal chandelier. But right at the edge of that medallion, facing the northern wall, was a tiny hairline crack in the paint. It was so small that no casual observer would ever notice it. But I knew it was there. I knew it was there because 3 years ago, when the foundation of this property slightly settled, my lead contractor had called me to inspect it. I remembered standing in this exact room, wearing a hard hat and a blazer authorizing the structural reinforcement of the floor joists below us. I knew the exact history of the Italian marble in the foyer and the exact warranty expiration date of the commercial-grade oven in the kitchen. Sitting there listening to Preston claim ownership of a house he knew absolutely nothing about felt like watching a toddler play dress-up in his father's clothes. His arrogant words washed over me, completely powerless against the heavy, ironclad truth resting in my designer handbag. My mother, Vivian, quickly rallied behind Preston. She found her voice again, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "Preston is absolutely right," she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "You have always been a hateful, jealous girl, Dominique. You cannot stand to see your sister thriving, making up vicious lies about her finances just to ruin our holiday dinner. You are sick in the head." My father Derek finally looked up from his plate, nodding in silent agreement with my mother, though he still refused to make eye contact with me. The unified front of the family was restored. They had successfully flipped the narrative. I was the crazy, jealous maid, and they were the wealthy victims of my unprovoked attack. Pastor Thomas murmured in agreement, folding his hands in prayer, as if asking God to forgive my wicked tongue. Aunt Denise let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, shaking her head in profound disappointment. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, the kind of smile used to put unruly children back in their designated corner. "Well, now that Dominique has gotten that little tantrum out of her system," Aunt Denise said, her voice dripping with condescension, "let us try to salvage this beautiful evening. We are not going to let your bitterness ruin a perfectly good turkey." Aunt Denise picked up the empty porcelain gravy boat from the center of the table and held it out in my direction. She gave it a little mocking shake. "Dominique, do make yourself useful, and take this to the kitchen for a refill," she ordered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You clearly do not know how to engage in polite dinner conversation, so why do you not stick to what you do best? Go on now, serving people is your specialty after all." My mother Vivian did not miss a beat. She immediately backed up Aunt Denise and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the stack of dirty appetizer plates near the centerpiece. "You heard your Aunt Dominique," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And while you are up, grab these salad plates too. There is absolutely no reason for us to sit around looking at a messy table when you are perfectly capable of making yourself useful." She waved her hand dismissively, acting as if I were simply a hired caterer who had forgotten her station. I looked at the faces around the table and felt a deep wave of disgust wash over me. This right here was the dark, toxic underbelly of our traditional family holidays. In so many African American households, we are taught to keep up appearances at all costs. We dress in our absolute best, we bow our heads in deep reverence, and we hold hands tightly while the pastor delivers a lengthy, passionate prayer, thanking God for our countless blessings and our unbreakable unity. We shout amen and pass the sweet potato pie, acting like the perfect picture of grace. But beneath the surface of that intense religious devotion there is often a vicious hierarchy. It is a social ladder built on college degrees, zip codes, and who managed to marry the most acceptable spouse. My mother was a master at this game. She could quote scripture about unconditional love and divine grace in one breath, and then use her very next breath to verbally slaughter her own daughter just to make herself look taller in front of her church friends. Religion in this dining room was never a genuine practice of faith. It was a weapon of social climbing and a heavy blanket used to smother any truth that did not fit their perfect narrative. I did not argue with her. I did not throw a childish tantrum or scream about the blatant disrespect. I simply pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up. The loud scraping sound of the chair legs against the hardwood floor made everyone pause. Chloe let out a small, satisfied huff and crossed her legs, believing I had finally surrendered to my rightful place at the bottom of the family food chain. Aunt Denise held the empty porcelain gravy boat out a little further, a smug grin on her face, fully expecting me to step forward and take it from her hand. Preston crossed his thick arms over his chest, leaning back in his chair with a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He actually believed he had won the standoff. He honestly believed his loud, booming voice and his inherent white privilege had successfully intimidated a black woman into silent obedience inside his supposedly grand home. I took a deliberate step forward, but I did not reach for the gravy boat. I completely ignored Aunt Denise, leaving her arms suspended awkwardly in the air over the roasted turkey. Instead, I began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the massive mahogany table. The dining room became so quiet that the only sound was the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my designer heels against the floorboards. I walked past my father, who was still staring firmly at his plate, refusing to intervene. I walked past Pastor Thomas, who looked mildly confused by my route, as I bypassed the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. I did not stop to gather any dirty plates. I walked with the slow, measured pace of an apex predator circling its prey. I finally stopped moving when I was standing directly behind Preston. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as my shadow fell over his shoulders. Chloe looked up at me, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in a tight, anxious frown. "What are you doing, Dominique?" She snapped, her voice tight with sudden, nervous energy. "The kitchen is exactly the opposite way." I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge her existence at all. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the side of Preston's face. I could smell his expensive designer cologne, a heavy, musky scent that was clearly meant to project power and wealth. But beneath that expensive fragrance, I could sense something else. I could sense the fragile ego of a man who was playing a dangerous game of pretend. I leaned down slowly, bringing my face just inches from his ear. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to strip him of his power. I spoke in a whisper so soft that only he could hear the exact words, but with a tone so razor-sharp it could have cut through solid glass. "Tell me, Preston," I murmured, my breath brushing against the collar of his custom shirt. "If you are such a brilliant financial mind managing millions in private equity, why is it that the Securities and Exchange Commission formally revoked the operating license for the Zenith Investment Fund exactly 6 months ago for defrauding your primary investors?" I pulled back just an inch and stood up straight, waiting to watch the physical transformation take over his body. It was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. The arrogant, rigid posture completely evaporated. His broad shoulders stiffened violently, as if he had just been struck by a high-voltage current. He reached for his silver dinner fork, blindly trying to act natural and pretend he had not just heard me. But his hand was shaking so uncontrollably that the metal fork clattered loudly against the rim of his expensive plate. He tried to grip it tighter, but his fingers betrayed him, and he dropped the fork entirely, letting it fall onto the white linen tablecloth. The deep, angry crimson color that had flushed his face just moments ago during his loud tirade drained away completely. In a matter of seconds, his skin turned a sickly pale gray. The illusion of the untouchable Wall Street titan shattered right before my eyes, leaving nothing but a terrified, desperate man sitting in a house he could not actually afford. He slowly turned his head to look up at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic, and I just gave him a slow, chilling smile. I straightened my posture and slowly walked back around the massive mahogany table. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels was the only sound cutting through the thick, heavy silence of the dining room. I glided past Pastor Thomas, who was staring at Preston with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. I gracefully pulled out my heavy wooden chair and sat back down, resting my hands neatly in my lap. Preston was still frozen in his seat. The silver fork he had dropped remained abandoned on the white linen tablecloth. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow jerks. A single bead of sweat rolled down his pale temple, completely ruining his polished Wall Street facade. I looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with every single person who had laughed at me just moments ago. My mother, Vivian, was frowning, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knit together in confusion as she tried to understand why the powerful white son-in-law she worshipped was suddenly looking like a cornered rat. Preston and I were just having a fascinating chat about his career, I announced, my voice ringing out clear and loud across the room. I picked up my wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid. He was just boasting about the millions he manages in private equity. So I simply asked him to explain how he continues to operate that highly successful fund when the Securities and Exchange Commission formally banned him from the financial industry 6 months ago. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Aunt Denise practically dropped her wine glass, her hand flying up to clutch the collar of her silk blouse. Pastor Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat loudly. I took a slow sip of my wine before delivering the final blow. I read the public filing myself. I continued speaking directly to Preston, but making sure every word reached my family. Case number 4892. Revocation of broker license and a permanent ban from managing third-party assets due to the gross mismanagement and embezzlement of $2.5 million from primary investors. Tell me, Preston, does your firm usually hire disgraced fraudsters to mop their floors, or do they reserve those positions for honest, hard-working people like me? Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. His total inability to defend himself was the most damning confession he could have possibly made. The booming, arrogant voice that had ordered me to the kitchen was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic silence of a man caught in a massive lie. Chloe slammed both of her hands onto the table. Her chair screeched as she shot up to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of pure rage and desperate denial. "You are a liar!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her designer silk blouse shaking with the force of her anger. "You are a sick, twisted liar, Dominique. You have spent your entire life being jealous of me. You are obsessed with my success and my marriage. You sit in your dirty little apartment scrubbing other people's filth for a living, and you just cannot stand the fact that I married a successful man. So you make up some ridiculous fake internet rumor to humiliate him at my Thanksgiving table." She rushed over to Preston, wrapping her arms fiercely around his stiff shoulders, playing the role of the fiercely loyal wife defending her besieged king. "Preston is transitioning his assets," she announced to the room, her voice shaking slightly. "He is in the middle of a complex corporate restructuring. That is all. It is high-level finance, something a maid would never be able to comprehend." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound of my amusement only enraged her further. I did not need to argue with her. The truth was sitting right there in her husband's terrified, sweating face. Chloe was either entirely complicit in his financial crimes, or she was so deeply desperate to maintain her image as the wealthy, successful doctor that she had willfully blinded herself to the fact that her husband was unemployed and facing potential federal charges. Knowing my sister, it was likely a toxic combination of both. My mother immediately jumped to Chloe's defense, finding her footing once again. "How dare you bring such disgusting accusations into this house?" Vivian hissed, glaring at me with a hatred so deep it chilled the air. "You come into your sister's beautiful home, eat the food paid for by her hard-working husband, and spit venom like a jealous snake. You are a disgrace to this family, Dominique. You always have been. You will apologize to Preston right this instant or so. Help me, God, I will have you removed." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I reached into my designer handbag, slowly retrieving my phone, intending to pull up the exact PDF of the federal indictment and read it aloud word for word. I was ready to burn their entire illusion to the ground, right there over the dry roasted turkey. But before I could unlock my screen, a sudden violent sound shattered the chaos. Bam! The heavy mahogany table shook violently as my father, Derek, slammed his large fist down against the wood. The crystal glasses rattled precariously. It was the first time he had made a sound all evening. The entire room went dead silent. Even Chloe stopped her frantic screeching, turning to look at our father in shock. Derek had spent his entire life hiding behind my mother's skirt, avoiding conflict at all costs. But right now his eyes were hard cold and filled with a calculating desperation that I had not seen since the day he begged me for my college fund. "Enough of this nonsense. Derek barked, his voice rough and commanding. I am sick and tired of this bickering. I do not care about any securities commission or whatever internet garbage Dominique is talking about. We are a family and we handle our matters behind closed doors. He took a deep breath, adjusting the collar of his suit, and then turned his cold gaze directly onto me. All the cowardly avoidance from earlier was gone. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a bank vault he was finally ready to crack open. The truth is, Dominique, you were not invited here tonight just to eat, my father stated, his tone completely devoid of any paternal warmth. You have been running that little cleaning business of yours for over 10 years now. Living in that tiny apartment, wearing cheap clothes, saving every penny like a miser. You have no husband, no children, and no real expenses. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, clasping his hands together. The real reason we brought you here tonight is because your sister is going through a temporary, transitional period with her clinic. Family protects family, Dominique. It is time for you to step up and do your part. We know you have money hoarded away, and we expect you to hand over those savings to help Chloe and Preston get through this minor rough patch. It is the least you can do to repay us for everything we have done for you. The heavy silence that followed my father's demand was thick enough to choke on. For a long moment, nobody moved. The crystal chandelier above us seemed to shine a little less brightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the lavish Thanksgiving spread. I sat perfectly still, looking at the man at the head of the table. Derek, the man who had ignored my existence for over a decade, was now looking at me with the expectant, demanding gaze of a patriarch collecting a tax. He actually believed his little speech about family loyalty would magically erase years of neglect and abuse. Preston let out a long, slow breath of relief. The color began to return to his pale face. He shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders back, as if my father's intervention had just rescued him from the firing squad. He looked at me with a renewed sense of arrogant entitlement, entirely comfortable with the idea of a black father extorting his own hardworking daughter to cover the financial crimes of his white son-in-law. Chloe sat up straighter, dabbing the corners of her eyes with her linen napkin. She immediately slipped back into her role as the delicate victim, nodding along with our father's ridiculous demand. My mother, Vivian, folded her hands, neatly resting them on the edge of the mahogany table. Her tone softened, shifting from aggressive hatred to manipulative sweetness. It is just a temporary loan, Dominique, she said, using that fake, gentle voice she usually reserved for the church choir director. Your sister and Preston have enormous overhead. Maintaining a lifestyle in a neighborhood like Buckhead requires capital. You live in a tiny apartment. You do not have a husband or a family to support. It is incredibly selfish of you to just sit on a pile of cash from your little cleaning jobs when your own flesh and blood is facing a minor cash flow interruption. Aunt Denise nodded vigorously, her large church hat bobbing up and down. That is right, Vivian, she chimed in, pointing her silver butter knife at me. The good book says to whom much is given, much is expected. Now we know you do not make doctor money, Dominique, but every little penny helps. You should be honored that your family is allowing you to contribute to their legacy. Family protects family. Those 3 words echoed in my mind, bouncing around the cavernous walls of that $3 million dining room. They sounded foreign, toxic, and utterly repulsive coming from their mouths. As they sat there demanding the money I had earned on my hands and knees, my mind aggressively pulled me back to a freezing, rainy Tuesday night 5 years ago. I was 29 years old, working 80-hour weeks, managing my growing cleaning business during the day, and scrubbing commercial office floors by myself until 2 in the morning just to save money on payroll. My body finally gave out. I collapsed in the middle of an empty corporate lobby. I woke up hours later in a stark, terrifyingly bright emergency room bed with an IV needle painfully jammed into my bruised forearm. The doctor told me I was suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic exhaustion, and a dangerous drop in my blood pressure. I was terrified, alone, and staring at a hospital bill I had no idea how to pay. With shaking hands, I had picked up my cheap, cracked cell phone and called my parents. I did not ask for a bailout. I did not ask them to pay the thousands of dollars in emergency room fees. I only asked my mother if she could please loan me $100 so I could afford the cab ride home and the copay for the prescription medication the doctor said I desperately needed to stabilize my heart rate. I remember the exact sound of my mother's voice crackling through the phone speaker. She sounded deeply annoyed. She told me that I was interrupting a very important meeting with a luxury caterer. She said they were busy finalizing the menu for Chloe's board certification celebration party. She told me that if I had chosen a respectable profession instead of being a common maid, I would have premium health insurance and would not need to beg for handouts. She told me to drink some water and walk it off. Then she hung up the phone. Not a single person from this family came to that hospital. Nobody sent a text to see if I was alive. I was discharged at 4 in the morning. Because I could not afford a taxi, I walked 3 miles back to my tiny cramped apartment in the freezing Atlanta rain, my body aching with every single step. That was the exact night the naive, desperate girl who craved her family's love completely died. The woman who walked into her apartment soaking wet and shivering was cold, calculated, and relentlessly focused on building an empire that nobody could ever take away. Yet here they were 5 years later, sitting behind expensive china plates, demanding that I empty my bank accounts to fund their fraudulent luxury lifestyle. Derek cleared his throat, bringing me back to the present moment. He tapped his thick index finger against the table impatiently. Well, Dominique, we do not have all night. Preston has run the numbers. A wire transfer of $80,000 by Monday morning should be enough to cover the immediate shortfalls and keep the clinic running smoothly until the restructuring is complete. You will transfer the funds. And in return, we will agree to put this ugly little dinner conversation behind us and welcome you back into the family fold. $80,000. They genuinely thought that was the absolute ceiling of my wealth. They thought demanding my entire life savings was doing me a favor. They expected me to bow my head, pull out a checkbook, and buy my way back into their toxic, abusive circle. I looked at Derek. I looked at Vivian. I looked at Preston and Chloe, who were practically holding their breath, waiting for the obedient maid to hand over the cash. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a sudden bubbling sensation rising in my chest. I started to smile. The smile grew wider and wider until a soft chuckle escaped my lips. The chuckle quickly morphed into a full-throated, resonant laugh. I leaned back in my chair, throwing my head back and laughing so hard that tears actually pricked the corners of my eyes. The sound of my genuine, uncontrollable amusement bounced off the expensive crown molding and shattered the tense atmosphere of the room. The family stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. Their expressions of entitled expectation quickly turned to absolute horror. Aunt Denise gasped, pulling her napkin to her chest. My mother's face twisted into an ugly snarl. "Stop laughing like a lunatic," Vivian hissed, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "We are discussing serious family business." I slowly caught my breath, wiping a stray tear of amusement from my cheek. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table, and looked directly across the turkey at my sister. The smug, entitled look had completely vanished from Chloe's face, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. $80,000, I repeated, letting the number roll off my tongue as if it were spare change found in the couch cushions. That is a very specific number, Derek, but before I even consider opening my purse, I have a very simple medical question for our brilliant doctor. I locked my eyes onto Chloe's, refusing to let her look away. "Tell me, Chloe," I asked, my voice dropping an octave, sending a chill straight through the center of the room. "What exactly do you need my money for? Is the $80,000 to pay off the massive commercial rent debt your clinic owes? Or is it to pay the federal fines for the tax evasion that caused the IRS to chain the doors of your precious dermatology practice shut last Tuesday?" Chloe froze. Her perfectly manicured hands, which had been resting elegantly on the white linen tablecloth, suddenly gripped the edge of the wood so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. Her jaw dropped, and she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She looked exactly like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. I did not break eye contact. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my smartphone. I calmly unlocked the screen and opened a high-resolution photograph I had received earlier that week. I turned the phone around and slid it across the polished mahogany table, letting it stop right in front of Pastor Thomas and Aunt Denise. You see, I have built a very extensive network in the commercial real estate sector over the past decade, I explained, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence. Property managers talk, landlords talk, and when the Internal Revenue Service shows up with federal agents to forcibly shut down a supposedly high-end dermatology clinic in the middle of a busy Tuesday afternoon, people definitely talk. Aunt Denise leaned forward, squinting through her reading glasses at the glowing screen. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp, pressing her hand over her heart. Pastor Thomas pushed his chair back slightly, his eyes widening in absolute shock. Right there on the screen was a crystal-clear image of the glass front doors of Chloe's luxury clinic. Slapped directly in the center of the tinted glass was a bright red and white official IRS seizure notice. A heavy metal padlock and a thick steel chain were wrapped tightly around the door handles, completely locking the business down. "That is not real," Chloe stammered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She frantically shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "It is just a misunderstanding with my accounting department. A clerical error. I'm getting it sorted out on Monday." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. "A clerical error," I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of her excuse hang in the air. "Chloe, you and I both know the federal government does not chain the doors of a medical practice shut over a simple paperwork mistake. That happens after months of ignored audits, unpaid penalties, and deliberate tax evasion. You have been funneling the money you owe the government into your luxury car payments, your designer wardrobe, and this fake wealthy lifestyle you parade around in front of our parents. You are completely bankrupt." The image of the perfect golden child, the brilliant doctor, who was supposed to elevate our family name, completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the dining room table. All those years my parents had bragged about her to the church congregation, all those times they had used her medical degree to belittle my cleaning business, it was all built on a massive, rotting lie. Chloe had taken the college fund I sacrificed for her and turned her life into a fraudulent house of cards. And now the wind was finally blowing it down. Preston stared at his wife, his face a mask of horrified realization. It became painfully obvious in that moment that they had been lying not just to the family, but to each other. He was hiding his revoked financial license, and she was hiding her federal tax evasion. They were two broke, desperate frauds playing dress-up in a $3 million mansion, trying to extort $80,000 from the sister they treated like garbage just to keep their sinking ship afloat for a few more weeks. Pastor Thomas slowly stood up from the table. He looked at my parents with a mixture of pity and severe judgment. "Well," he murmured, his voice tight with discomfort, "it seems this family has some very serious personal matters to discuss. I believe I should take my leave." "No," Vivian practically screamed. My mother shot up from her chair, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She looked at the phone on the table and then glared at me with a hatred so pure and unhinged it made the air in the room feel heavy. "You fake this," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You paid someone to make that picture. You are trying to frame your own sister because you have always been a bitter, jealous little nobody. You could never handle the fact that Chloe is beautiful and smart and everything you are not." "Mom, stop it," Derek muttered, rubbing his temples, looking completely defeated as his retirement plan crumbled before his eyes. But Vivian was completely gone. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being the mother of a successful, wealthy doctor. Facing the reality that her favorite daughter was a fraud facing federal charges was a psychological break she simply could not handle. She needed a scapegoat. She needed it to be my fault. "You called them," Vivian screamed, her voice echoing hysterically. "You called the tax office and lied about her. You are trying to destroy my family, you wicked, evil girl." Before anyone could react, my mother stormed around the edge of the large table. Her designer heels stomped aggressively against the hardwood floor. I sat perfectly still, watching her close the distance between us. I did not flinch or raise my hands to defend myself. I wanted everyone in this room to witness exactly who this woman was when her mask was completely ripped off. Vivian reached my chair, pulled her arm back, and swung with all her might. The sharp, loud crack of her palm striking my cheekbone echoed like a gunshot through the dining room. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side. A stinging, burning pain flared across my skin, and the metallic taste of blood instantly bloomed in the corner of my mouth where my teeth had caught my inner lip. Aunt Denise let out a terrified shriek. Derek jumped out of his chair, shouting my mother's name. But I did not fall. I did not cry. I slowly turned my head back to face the woman who gave birth to me. My cheek was throbbing and radiating heat, but my eyes were completely dead and devoid of any remaining affection. The physical strike was the absolute final nail in the coffin of our relationship. "Get out of my daughter's house!" Vivian spat, her chest heaving as she stood over me, her hands still raised as if she might strike me again. "Get out! You are dead to me. You are nothing but trash, and you will never set foot in this family again." Preston let out a loud, forced laugh, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of deep uncertainty. He looked at my calm demeanor and clearly could not compute why a black woman standing in a house she supposedly did not own was not trembling in fear at the threat of law enforcement. "You are bluffing," he sneered, taking another step toward me. "You think acting tough is going to save you from getting a criminal record? You are nothing but a glorified janitor, Dominique." I stood my ground, completely unbothered by his proximity. My cheek was still throbbing from my mother's brutal slap, but the physical pain was entirely secondary to the profound sense of victory blooming in my chest. I had successfully baited them into digging their own graves. I could taste the copper of my own blood, but it tasted like absolute freedom. My mother, Vivian, was pacing back and forth at the head of the table. She was muttering to herself, straightening the silverware as if fixing the table setting would somehow fix her shattered reality. "This is my daughter's house." Vivian kept repeating, her voice shrill and borderline hysterical. "You do not disrespect my family and my daughter's $3 million home." I looked at Vivian and felt a twinge of dark amusement. She was so fiercely protective of the brick and mortar surrounding us, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently standing in a property that I had purchased in cash 2 years ago. She was defending a fantasy while standing right on top of my reality. Chloe was hyperventilating, clinging to the edge of the mahogany table. Her mind was clearly split between the terror of the federal tax seizure I had just exposed and her burning hatred for me. She wanted me gone so she could resume living in her fake world. "Just throw her out now, Preston," Chloe begged, wiping away her mascara-stained tears. "Do not wait for security. Grab her and physically throw her onto the driveway. She does not belong here." That was exactly what Preston needed to hear. He needed his wife to give him the green light to enact violence. It fueled his massive, fragile ego. He rolled up the sleeves of his expensive shirt all the way past his elbows, exposing his thick forearms. He cracked his knuckles, trying to look like an intimidating bouncer rather than a disgraced, unemployed fraud. "I am going to count to 3, Preston warned, lowering his stance. "If you are not walking toward that front door by the time I reach 3, I am grabbing you by the collar and dragging you across the marble foyer myself." 1. I did not move. I maintained absolute eye contact with him. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders relaxed. I was not a helpless 20-year-old girl anymore. I was a 35-year-old self-made woman who regularly negotiated with ruthless commercial real estate tycoons. A sweating, desperate man in a dining room did not intimidate me in the slightest. 2. Preston took a deep breath, closing the distance between us. He reached his large hand out, aiming directly for the lapel of my designer blazer. His intention was clear. He wanted to physically humiliate me. He wanted to assert his physical dominance to compensate for his absolute financial failure. He wanted to prove to everyone in the room that he was still the man in charge. I shifted my weight slightly, staring directly at his outstretched hand. "Do it," I whispered. "Put your hands on me, Preston. Commit felony assault in front of 5 witnesses while waiting for private security to arrive. Let us see how that helps your pending federal fraud indictment." His hand froze mid-air just 2 inches from my chest. The absolute icy conviction in my voice hit him like a physical blow. He suddenly remembered the Securities and Exchange Commission document I had read aloud. He remembered that he was already on the verge of federal prison. Assaulting a woman in front of a pastor and several family members would be the final nail in his coffin. The reality of his precarious legal situation finally pierced through his blind arrogance. He slowly lowered his hand, his jaw clenching so hard I could hear his teeth grinding together. "You are sick," he muttered, taking a large step back. "You are a complete psychopath, Dominique." "No, Preston," I replied calmly, smoothing the front of my blazer. "I am simply a woman who knows the law, and I know exactly what happens to men like you when they finally lose control." The tension in the dining room was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Pastor Thomas and Aunt Denise had completely retreated, pressing themselves against the far wall near the kitchen doors, wanting absolutely no part in this escalating hostility. My father Derek was sitting heavily in his chair, staring blankly at his cold mashed potatoes, completely useless and silent. He had watched his wife strike me, and he was now watching his son-in-law threaten me with physical violence, and he did absolutely nothing to intervene. His cowardice was fully on display for everyone to see. The smell of the roasted turkey and the expensive wine soured in the air, completely overpowered by the stench of their hypocrisy. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. The grand-grandfather clock in the hallway chimed loudly, signaling the passing time. My family was trapped in a purgatory of their own making. They could not force me out, and they were terrified of what would happen when the authorities finally arrived. They were banking everything on the assumption that the Buckhead security team would blindly side with the wealthy white homeowner and immediately arrest the black intruder. They relied on systemic bias to do their dirty work. They truly believed that my skin color and my profession as a cleaner would automatically make me the villain in the eyes of the law. It was a vile calculation, but it was exactly how they had operated their entire lives. They used their perceived social standing to crush anyone who challenged their narrative. They expected the world to bow to their expensive clothes and their zip code. Suddenly, a sweeping flash of bright yellow and white lights cut through the darkness outside. The intense beams illuminated the large arched windows of the dining room, casting long, moving shadows across the mahogany table. The heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over the gravel driveway signaled that the Buckhead Estate's private security response team had arrived. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "Thank God," she breathed, pressing a hand to her chest. "Finally, we can get this trash out of our home." Vivian immediately straightened her designer dress, patting down her hair. She plastered a deeply concerned, victimized look onto her face, ready to play the traumatized mother for the officers. She was preparing the exact lies she would tell them to ensure I was taken away in handcuffs. Derek slowly stood up, preparing to back up whatever fabricated story his wife and son-in-law were about to deliver. Preston puffed his chest out entirely, regaining his arrogant swagger. The fear that had paralyzed him just moments ago vanished completely. He felt safe again because he believed the men outside were there to serve him. He pointed a thick finger at me, a vicious sneer twisting his features. "This is the end of the line for you, Dominique. I hope you enjoy the back of a squad car." Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded up the front porch steps. A loud, authoritative knock rattled the massive wooden front doors. It was the sound of impending consequences. The heavy thuds echoed through the massive foyer, making the crystal chandelier vibrate slightly above our heads. "I will get it," Preston announced, marching proudly out of the dining room and into the grand marble foyer. He was eager to be the hero who handed over the dangerous intruder. He reached out and pulled the heavy double doors open wide. Good evening, officers, Preston said, his voice dripping with fake relief and exaggerated distress. Thank you so much for responding so quickly. The situation has escalated. The intruder is in the dining room, and she is refusing to leave my property. Please come in and remove her immediately. She is highly unstable. I remained perfectly still in the center of the dining room, holding my expensive leather handbag. I listened to the heavy boots of the security officers stepping onto the Italian marble floors. I heard the static crackle of their radios. I knew exactly who was on duty tonight. I had personally vetted and hired every single guard on this premium security detail, and I knew exactly what was about to happen next. The 5 minutes it took for the Buckhead Estates private security team to navigate the winding roads of the gated community felt like a lifetime to everyone in the room, except me. Time has a funny way of stretching when people are trapped in a cage of their own making. Preston had confidently slipped his phone back into his pocket, leaning against the archway of the dining room like a victorious gladiator. He crossed his arms over his chest, completely blocking the exit. He was making sure the dangerous intruder could not escape before the authorities arrived to cart her away. He did not realize I had absolutely no intention of leaving. The heavy silence that followed his phone call lasted exactly 30 seconds before my mother simply could not contain her venom any longer. The reality of the situation, the fact that I was completely unbothered by the threat of police intervention, seemed to break the last remaining shred of her sanity. Vivian began to pace the length of the mahogany table, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are the absolute biggest mistake of my life," Vivian hissed, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "I should have known you would turn out like this. From the moment you were a child, you were always so stubborn, always so difficult. You never fit in with the grace and elegance of this family. You are a stain on our legacy, Dominique. You are a complete and utter disgrace to our bloodline." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me like water off a duck's back. Chloe immediately jumped in, emboldened by our mother's vicious attack. She gripped the back of her dining chair, her knuckles stark white. "You are going to look so pathetic in a mugshot." Chloe spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and vindictive excitement. "I am going to file a permanent restraining order against you the second they drag you out of here. I am going to make sure you can never come within 100 yards of me, my husband, or my clinic ever again. You are a psychotic, jealous loser who scrubs toilets for a living. You are nothing. You have always been nothing." Even Aunt Denise, who had spent the entire evening pretending to be the picture of Christian grace, decided to reveal her true colors. She adjusted her large church hat and glared at me from the far end of the table. "You brought this on yourself, Dominique," she muttered, shaking her head. "The Lord punishes the wicked and the envious. You tried to destroy your sister's beautiful marriage with your vicious lies, and now you are going to pay the price. You have broken your poor mother's heart." My father, Derek, remained exactly where he was, sitting heavily in his chair, staring blankly at the cold mashed potatoes on his plate. He did not say a word to defend me. He did not ask his wife to stop screaming. He just sat there, a pathetic shell of a man, hoping the storm would pass over his head without requiring him to show an ounce of courage. They threw every single insult they could think of at me. They tried to tear down my character, my career, my appearance, and my sanity. They wanted to see me break. They wanted to see the terrified little girl they used to bully and manipulate. But that little girl was long gone. As they continued their frantic, hysterical verbal assault, I simply looked down at my outfit. I reached out and gently smoothed a microscopic wrinkle from the fabric of my tailored designer skirt. I adjusted the cuffs of my silk blouse. I checked the time on my diamond-encrusted Cartier watch, a piece of jewelry that alone cost more than Preston's entire fraudulent investment portfolio. I was completely and utterly unfazed. In my professional life as the chief executive officer of a luxury real estate management firm, I had sat across from some of the most ruthless, intimidating businessmen in the country. I had faced down hostile takeover boards, aggressive union leaders, and cutthroat property developers. I had spent hours locked in high-stakes boardrooms negotiating commercial contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. In those rooms, the men wore custom suits and smiled while they tried to slit your throat financially. I had learned how to read micro-expressions, how to control my breathing, and how to use silence as a weapon of mass destruction. I knew how to hold my ground when millions of dollars were on the line. Compared to those boardroom battles, the people in this dining room were absolute amateurs. They were entirely driven by fragile egos, desperate panic, and fake prestige. They had no leverage. They had no power. They only had their loud voices and their pathetic delusions. I did not need to scream back at them. I did not need to defend my honor. When you hold all the cards in the deck, you do not need to bluff. You just sit back and wait for the other players to push all their chips into the center of the table. So I let them talk. I let them exhaust themselves. I stood tall, my posture perfect, my breathing slow and measured. The contrast between my cold, calculated professionalism and their sweaty, frantic desperation was stark. Chloe was practically hyperventilating. Vivian was red in the face, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled from her manic pacing. Preston was sweating through his custom shirt, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot as he guarded the doorway. They were completely unraveling, while I was merely waiting for my cue. The psychological warfare of my silence was destroying them faster than any insult I could have thrown back. "Why are you not saying anything?" Chloe suddenly screamed, her voice cracking. "Why are you just standing there looking at us like that? Stop looking at me like that." I did not answer her. I just offered her a slow, chilling smile. That smile seemed to terrify her more than my anger ever could. She shrank back behind her chair, her eyes darting nervously toward the large arched windows. The heavy, suffocating tension in the room reached its absolute boiling point. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, counting down the final seconds of their reign of terror. Then the sound cut through the night. A loud, piercing siren wailed in the distance, quickly growing closer and louder. Sweeping flashes of bright yellow and white emergency lights sliced through the darkness outside, illuminating the dining room windows and casting long, frantic shadows across the walls. The heavy, aggressive crunch of thick tires slamming onto the gravel driveway echoed through the property. The Buckhead Estates private security response team had arrived. Preston let out a loud, booming laugh of absolute triumph. He pointed a thick finger at me, his face twisted into a vicious sneer. "Time is up, Dominique," he barked, pushing himself off the archway. "The authorities are here. I hope you enjoyed your final moments in a civilized home, because you are about to spend the night in a concrete cell." He spun around and marched proudly out of the dining room and into the grand marble foyer, eager to play the heroic victim. Vivian and Chloe immediately rushed to follow him, wanting to secure front-row seats to my impending humiliation. They crowded into the hallway behind Preston, pointing eagerly toward the massive wooden front doors. I took a slow, deep breath, grabbing my leather handbag and walking steadily out of the dining room to join them in the foyer. I stopped a few feet behind my family, watching the back of Preston's head. Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded up the front porch steps. A loud, authoritative knock rattled the heavy double doors, vibrating the crystal chandelier above our heads. Preston reached out and swung the doors wide open. "Good evening, officers," Preston said loudly, his voice dripping with exaggerated distress and fake relief. "Thank you so much for responding so quickly. The intruder is right here. She is highly unstable and refusing to leave my property. Please come in and remove her immediately." The flashing yellow and white lights from the patrol vehicles bathed the marble foyer in a harsh, chaotic glow. Through the open doorway, two massive, broad-shouldered security officers stepped over the threshold and entered the house. They wore crisp black tactical uniforms, heavy utility belts, and stern, uncompromising expressions. Both of them had their hands resting firmly on their radio communicators, ready for immediate action. The two security officers stepped fully into the grand marble foyer, bringing the cold, crisp autumn air of the November night in with them. The flashing yellow and white emergency lights from their parked patrol vehicles outside cast long, rhythmic shadows across the expensive Italian marble floor. The intense beams of light sliced through the warm, ambient glow of the crystal chandelier, creating a chaotic, disorienting atmosphere inside the supposedly perfect $3 million mansion. The sheer size and physical presence of the officers instantly made the massive grand entryway feel incredibly small and suffocating. The man taking the lead was Captain Davis. I knew him very well, though nobody else in my family had the slightest clue. He was a tall, powerfully built African-American man in his late 40s with a military background and a completely no-nonsense demeanor. His black tactical uniform was impeccably pressed, and his heavy utility belt jingled slightly with the weight of his equipment as he moved. His partner, a younger, equally imposing officer named Hayes, stepped in right behind him, taking up a defensive position near the heavy double doors. Preston, completely oblivious to the reality of the situation, puffed his chest out and stepped forward to greet them. He stood perfectly straight, adjusting the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt, trying to project the image of a wealthy, powerful homeowner whose peace had just been violently disturbed. He looked at Captain Davis with a deeply ingrained sense of arrogant entitlement. It was the specific kind of absolute confidence that only a mediocre white man standing in a wealthy zip code could possess. He fully expected these two black security officers to instantly recognize his perceived authority, to bow to his demands, and to blindly remove the black woman standing in his hallway without asking a single question. "Thank God you are here," Preston said, his voice dripping with a sickening mixture of fake relief and authoritative command. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at me. "That is her. That is the intruder I called about. She forced her way into my home during our private Thanksgiving dinner, and she is completely out of control." Captain Davis stopped a few feet away from Preston. His face was a completely unreadable mask of professional stoicism. He did not immediately reach for his handcuffs. He did not bark any orders. He simply allowed his sharp, observant eyes to scan the room, absorbing the scene before him. He looked at Preston, who was sweating profusely and breathing heavily. Then he looked at Vivian and Chloe, who were huddled together near the dining room archway, looking like amateur actresses performing in a terrible daytime soap opera. Finally, his eyes landed on me, standing calmly in the center of the foyer, holding my designer handbag with a visible red welt swelling across my right cheekbone where my mother had slapped me. Preston mistook Captain Davis' professional silence for hesitation. His inherent privilege flared up violently, and he decided he needed to escalate his demands to force the officers into immediate action. "Did you hear me?" Preston barked, taking a step closer to Captain Davis, aggressively invading the officer's personal space. "I said that woman is trespassing. She is nothing but a common maid, a cleaner who has some kind of psychotic obsession with my wife. She came in here screaming, demanding money, and threatening physical violence against my family. I want her arrested right now. Put her in handcuffs and drag her out of my house before she hurts someone." My mother Vivian immediately chimed in, eager to add fuel to the fire and guarantee my absolute destruction. She stepped out from behind Preston, clutching her pearl necklace with one hand and pointing at me with the other. "It is true," Vivian cried out, forcing a dramatic quiver into her voice. "She is a deeply disturbed individual. She even tried to attack me. Look at her standing there with no remorse. We are terrified for our lives. Please, officers, you have to take her away. She does not belong in a neighborhood like this. She is a dangerous criminal." Chloe nodded vigorously, wiping away a perfectly timed fake tear from her cheek. "She has been harassing us all evening," Chloe added, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "My husband asked her politely to leave multiple times, and she refused. She said she was going to destroy my medical practice. You need to get her out of here so we can feel safe in our own home again." I stood perfectly still, listening to my own flesh and blood weave a web of absolute lies to a pair of armed security guards. They were actively trying to put me in the back of a police cruiser. They were actively trying to give me a criminal record simply because I had exposed their financial frauds and refused to let them extort my life savings. They were weaponizing the justice system against me, completely banking on the assumption that the security guards would look at my skin color, look at my profession as a cleaner, and automatically assume I was the aggressor. It was a vile, disgusting tactic, but it was perfectly aligned with exactly who they were as people. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, staring at Captain Davis with intense, expectant eyes. "Well," Preston demanded, his tone shifting from fake victimhood to outright condescension. "What are you waiting for? I pay thousands of dollars a month in homeowners association fees to keep scum like her out of my neighborhood. Do your job and get this trash off my property. Put the cuffs on her right now." The heavy silence in the grand marble foyer was deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to echo like a beating drum. The flashing emergency lights outside continued to sweep across the walls, creating a dizzying strobe effect. My family held their collective breath, waiting for the ultimate satisfying conclusion to their orchestrated drama. They waited for the heavy metallic click of the handcuffs snapping around my wrists. They waited for the physical humiliation they believed I so rightfully deserved. Captain Davis slowly shifted his gaze away from Preston. He looked at my mother, who was trembling with fake fear. He looked at Chloe, who was hiding behind her husband's shoulder. And then he looked back at Preston, assessing the arrogant, unemployed fraud with a look of deep, profound pity. Captain Davis knew exactly who I was. He knew that I was not a common maid. He knew that I was the chief executive officer and sole founder of Lux Haven Estates, the premier luxury property management firm that owned and operated over 40 high-end commercial and residential properties across the state of Georgia. He knew this because my management firm was the exact entity that signed his security company's massive six-figure annual contract. He knew this because he and I had sat in my corporate boardroom just 3 weeks ago discussing the upgraded surveillance protocols for this exact neighborhood. He knew exactly whose name was on the deed to this $3 million mansion, and he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was not the sweating, red-faced white man currently screaming orders at him. I maintained absolute eye contact with Captain Davis. I did not give him a signal. I did not need to. He was a highly trained professional who instantly recognized a pathetic, fraudulent setup when he saw one. He saw the swelling bruise on my cheek, and his jaw tightened imperceptibly, recognizing that the only actual victim of physical assault in this room was me. Preston let out a loud, frustrated sigh, throwing his hands up in the air. "Are you deaf?" Preston yelled, completely losing his temper. "I am the homeowner. I am telling you to arrest this woman. If you do not put her in handcuffs this exact second, I am calling your supervisor and having you fired." Captain Davis did not flinch. He did not argue. He simply adjusted the heavy utility belt around his waist and took a deliberate step forward. Preston immediately flashed a massive, triumphant smirk. He uncrossed his arms and stepped to the side, clearing the path for the officer. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with pure, malicious victory. He actually believed he had won. He believed his loud voice and his hollow threats had successfully commanded the authorities to do his bidding. Vivian let out a loud sigh of relief, and Chloe actually smiled a wicked, vindictive little smile. But Captain Davis did not walk toward me with his handcuffs drawn. He walked directly toward Preston. And then, without breaking his stride, he walked right past him. He completely ignored the arrogant white man, as if he were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture blocking the hallway. He bypassed Vivian and Chloe entirely, not even offering them a second glance. The smug, triumphant smile on Preston's face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, absolute confusion. He spun around, watching the large security officer approach me. Captain Davis stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He stood at perfect military attention, his posture impeccably straight. He completely ignored the frantic, screaming family behind him. Instead, he looked me directly in the eye respectfully, acknowledging the bruise on my face before offering a crisp, highly professional nod of his head. Good evening, boss, Captain Davis said, his deep baritone voice echoing loudly and clearly across the dead-silent foyer. Are any of the tenants causing trouble tonight? The word boss dropped into the grand marble foyer like a lead weight. The word tenants followed immediately after it, striking with the destructive force of a wrecking ball. The silence that gripped the room was no longer just tense, it was entirely absolute. It was a suffocating vacuum where all the air had been instantly sucked out, leaving everyone gasping for breath. Preston stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open slightly. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently etched onto his face for the last hour was completely wiped clean. He looked at Captain Davis, and then slowly turned his head to look at me, his brain entirely incapable of processing the information he had just heard. His deeply ingrained white privilege was violently short-circuiting. He had fully expected this African-American security officer to obey him without question. Instead, he was witnessing the officer submit to the absolute authority of the very black woman he had just threatened to throw into the street. Tenants. Preston finally stammered, his voice, a pathetic, weak rasp that sounded nothing like his previous booming commands. What are you talking about? I am the homeowner. I called you. Captain Davis did not even blink. He did not turn his head to acknowledge Preston. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on me, treating the sweating white man beside him as nothing more than a mild auditory nuisance. He was a seasoned professional waiting for his actual employer to give him his marching orders. Everything is under control for the moment, Captain Davis, I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. I am just wrapping up a brief conversation with the current occupants of the property. Please have your team stand by on the driveway. I may require your assistance to escort them off the premises permanently in just a few minutes. Understood, boss, Captain Davis replied without a single second of hesitation. He took one step back, offering another crisp nod, before turning around and walking right out the heavy double doors. Officer Hayes followed him, pulling the massive wooden doors shut behind them. The heavy thud of the doors closing echoed through the foyer, sealing my family inside with their worst nightmare. The flashing emergency lights outside continued to paint the frosted glass, casting eerie moving shadows across their terrified faces. Chloe had both of her hands clamped tightly over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a kind of raw, primal terror I had never seen from her before. The fragile foundation of her fake luxury life was actively crumbling beneath her designer heels. My mother, Vivian, looked like she was going to physically pass out. She leaned heavily against the archway, clutching her chest, her mind desperately trying to reject the reality unfolding in front of her. The power dynamic in the room had completely and violently shifted. For 35 years, they had looked down on me. They had weaponized my profession as a cleaner to elevate themselves. They genuinely believed that because I scrubbed floors, I belonged at the bottom of the social hierarchy, while they, with their medical degrees and private equity funds, sat comfortably at the very top. They did not understand that real wealth does not scream for attention at a Thanksgiving dinner table. Real wealth does not need to belittle others to feel powerful. Real wealth works quietly in the shadows, acquiring assets, building portfolios, and buying the very ground that arrogant people stand on. They had spent their entire lives worshiping the illusion of success, while I had spent the last decade quietly buying up the reality of it. I did not say a word to any of them in the hallway. I simply turned my back, giving Preston the ultimate display of disrespect, and began walking slowly back toward the dining room. The rhythmic clicking of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the house. I could hear their hesitant, shuffling footsteps behind me. They followed me, drawn back into the dining room like moths pulling themselves toward a blazing fire. They had lost all ability to command the situation. They were now completely at my mercy, waiting to see what I was going to do next. I walked past the large arched windows and stepped up to my designated chair at the mahogany table. Resting perfectly on the seat where I had left it was my handbag. It was not just any handbag, it was a genuine Hermes Birkin, 35 crafted from black togo leather with gleaming palladium hardware. I saw Chloe's eyes immediately lock onto it. As a woman obsessed with designer brands and luxury status symbols, she knew exactly what she was looking at. She knew that the bag sitting on my chair was not a fake replica ordered off the internet like the ones hiding in her own closet. She recognized the flawless stitching, the exact slouch of the premium leather, and the unmistakable aura of an item that cost upward of $30,000. Her breathing hitched. The realization hit her like a physical blow. A common maid could not walk into an Hermes boutique and purchase a Birkin bag in cash. Only a woman of immense, undeniable capital could. I reached down and picked up the bag by its rolled leather handles. The leather felt cool and familiar against my skin. To my family, this bag was the ultimate status symbol. To me, it was a trophy. It was a tangible reminder of the blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights I had invested into building Lux Haven Estates, from a single bucket and mop into a multi-million-dollar empire. I slowly unclasped the signature hardware, folding the front flap back. The room was so quiet that the soft click of the metal sounded like a gunshot. Preston was standing near the edge of the table, his face a sickly pale gray. "What is going on, Dominique?" he whispered, his voice trembling. What did that security guard mean? I did not look at him. I reached deep into the spacious interior of the Birkin bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and my keys, wrapping firmly around a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. I pulled the file folder out into the light. It was a premium heavy stock manila folder. Stamped directly onto the front cover in bold, uncompromising ink was the official red seal of the state of Georgia. It was the undeniable weight of absolute legal authority. It was the receipt for every single insult, every single slap, and every single tear I had ever shed for this toxic family. I held the thick folder up for a brief second, letting the bright light of the crystal chandelier catch the red state seal. Then, with a swift, aggressive motion, I swung my arm down and slammed the heavy folder directly into the center of the dining table. The thick stack of documents hit the massive roasted turkey with a sickening wet thud. The impact crushed the crispy skin of the bird, sending a spray of dark gravy and cheap canned cranberry sauce flying across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The expensive china platters rattled violently. The desecration of their perfect fake holiday meal was absolute. Preston flinched violently as the gravy splattered across the table, narrowly missing his expensive trousers. He stared at the thick file resting on top of the ruined turkey, as if it were an active explosive device. He was terrified to touch it. He knew that whatever was inside that folder was going to completely obliterate the fragile fantasy world he had constructed for himself. "Read it," I commanded, my voice echoing with the cold, hard authority of a billionaire CEO addressing a room full of bankrupt frauds. "Read exactly whose house you are standing in." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "You wanted to play the powerful homeowner?" I continued, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You wanted to dictate who belongs in this neighborhood and who gets to wear handcuffs. Pick up the file, Preston. Read the deed aloud for the entire family." With a shaking hand, Preston slowly reached out. His fingers hovered over the red seal for a fraction of a second, before he pulled the heavy folder toward him, wiping a smear of cranberry sauce off the cover. He opened it slowly, as if the paper itself might burn his skin. His eyes scanned the top page. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a literal corpse. His jaw went completely slack, and his knees actually buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself standing upright. Chloe let out a pathetic whimper, stepping up beside him to look over his shoulder at the documents. As her eyes traced the bold black letters printed on the official state letterhead, she let out a loud, gasping sob, pressing both hands over her face. "My mother." Vivian stood paralyzed at the end of the table, entirely unable to comprehend the absolute destruction of her favorite golden child. Derek, my cowardly father, finally looked up from his plate, his eyes darting back and forth between the ruined turkey, the legal documents, and the cold, unforgiving expression on my face. The absolute transfer of power was now complete. The maid was officially holding the deed to their lives. Preston stood there trembling so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled loudly in his grip. His eyes darted back and forth across the bold black ink at the top of the legal document. He read the words over and over again, as if hoping that staring at them long enough would magically rearrange the letters into a reality he could actually accept. But the official seal of the state of Georgia remained completely unchanged. "Read it," Preston froze, commanded my voice slicing cleanly through the suffocating silence of the dining room. "If you cannot find the courage to read it out loud, I will be more than happy to explain it to everyone in this room. That document you are holding with your shaking hands is the official property deed. This $3 million estate with its Italian marble floors, custom crown molding, and 6 luxurious bedrooms does not belong to you. It belongs to a private luxury real estate holding company called Lux Haven LLC. Chloe let out another choked, agonizing sob. She dug her manicured fingernails into the edge of the mahogany table. She knew the name Lux Haven. Anyone who tried to navigate the affluent circles of Buckhead knew that exact name. It was the premier property management firm that owned dozens of the most exclusive commercial and residential estates in the city. It was a name whispered with deep respect at the country club she was so desperately trying to join. And the most fascinating thing about Lux Haven LLC, I continued pacing slowly around the ruined Thanksgiving turkey, is that it does not have a board of directors. It does not have any outside investors or shareholders. It is entirely owned and operated by a single founder and president. Turn to the second page, Preston. Look right below the signature line for the legal representative. Preston swallowed hard, his throat making a loud clicking sound that echoed in the quiet room. He fumbled with the thick paper, clumsily flipping to the second page. He stared at the signature. It was my signature. Right below it, printed in stark, undeniable ink, was my full legal name. "No," Preston stammered, shaking his head back and forth. "This is a trick. This is a fake document. We did not rent from you. We signed our lease agreement with a commercial brokerage called Pinnacle Properties. We dealt with a leasing agent. You have absolutely nothing to do with this house. You are just a cleaner." I let out a soft, chilling laugh. "Pinnacle Properties is nothing but a shell brokerage, Preston. It is a minor subsidiary branch in my corporate network. I bought that agency entirely in cash 3 years ago to handle my residential acquisitions. When my leasing office received the rental application from a so-called brilliant doctor and a private equity manager, I personally reviewed the file." I stopped pacing and stood directly across from him, locking my eyes onto his terrified, pale face. "I saw your financial background, Preston. I saw your absolutely abysmal credit score. I saw the mountain of debt Chloe had accumulated just trying to buy designer clothes and luxury cars to maintain her fake image. Neither of you had any financial institution willing to underwrite a mortgage for a $3 million house. You did not even qualify for a standard loan on a middle-class condo." Chloe buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly. The absolute destruction of her carefully crafted illusion was total. I looked at her shaking shoulders and felt no pity. "Because of your massive egos and your desperate burning need to show off a fake wealthy lifestyle to our parents and your social circle, you decided to rent an estate you could not actually afford?" I explained, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You wanted the perfect backdrop for your social media posts and your hypocritical holiday dinners. So you signed an incredibly expensive rental agreement with Pinnacle Properties, completely unaware that every single month your exorbitant rent check was being deposited directly into my personal corporate accounts." I looked around the room, making sure every single person understood the absolute irony of the situation. "Yes, Mother," I said, turning my gaze to Vivian. "Yes, Father. The daughter you spent the entire evening calling a maid, the daughter you ordered to clear away your dirty dishes, is the actual landlord of this perfect family. You walked into my property, You insulted the food I supposedly could not afford, you mocked my career, and you tried to throw me out of the very house that I own free and clear. You do not own a single brick in this entire estate. You are nothing but broke tenants desperately clinging to a delusion. The truth hit them with the destructive force of a Category 5 hurricane. Every single layer of their perfect facade, every ounce of their unearned arrogance, every lie they had ever told to elevate themselves was violently ripped apart. The flawless dermatologist and the wealthy Wall Street titan were exposed as two broke, desperate frauds, playing house in a mansion owned by the sister they treated like garbage. Pastor Thomas, who had spent the evening offering hollow religious platitudes and judging my character, now sat completely frozen in his chair. His face was entirely pale, his hands resting limply on his lap. Aunt Denise, who had mockingly ordered me to fetch the gravy, was trembling uncontrollably. She pressed both of her hands flat against her chest, as if trying to stop her heart from beating out of her rib cage. My father, Derek, was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between the ruined turkey, the legal documents, and the cold, unforgiving expression on my face. He finally realized that the daughter he had financially drained all those years ago had grown into an untouchable financial powerhouse that he could never hope to manipulate again. But the most spectacular reaction came from my mother, Vivian, the woman who had slapped me across the face, the woman who had screamed that I was the ultimate disgrace to her bloodline, suddenly lost all the strength in her body. The expensive designer heels she was wearing could no longer support the weight of her shattered reality. She stumbled backward, her knees completely buckling beneath her. She bumped into the heavy wooden dining chair and collapsed. The chair tipped over, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp bang. Vivian fell right beside it, landing heavily on the Italian marble floor, her expensive silk dress wrinkling pathetically around her. She stared up at me, her eyes wide open and filled with an indescribable, profound horror. Her perfectly applied makeup was beginning to run. Her flawless hair was completely disheveled. The entire social hierarchy she had worshipped for 60 years, the system that placed doctors at the top and cleaners at the bottom, was completely annihilated. She had spent her entire life believing that manual labor made me worthless. She had truly believed that my commercial cleaning business was nothing more than a bucket and a mop. She never bothered to understand that my cleaning company had evolved into a massive corporate facilities management empire holding lucrative government and commercial contracts across the entire East Coast. I had used the massive profits from those contracts to aggressively acquire luxury real estate building Lux Haven LLC from the ground up. Dominique, Vivian gasped, her voice cracking and breaking into a weak, pathetic whisper. Her trembling hands gripped the edge of the fallen wooden chair as she desperately tried to pull herself up, but she simply did not have the physical strength. This cannot be real. You only have a small cleaning service. You live in a tiny apartment. How could you possibly own a house like this? I walked slowly toward her, the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoing in the dead silent room. I stood over the woman who had birthed me, looking down at her pathetic, crumpled form. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I only felt the cold, calculated satisfaction of a perfectly executed strategy. I live in a modest apartment because I do not have a pathetic psychological need to show off to people who do not actually care about me, I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth. I invest my capital into appreciating assets, not into depreciating designer dresses or expensive dry turkeys bought on maxed-out credit cards. Vivian opened and closed her mouth like a suffocating fish. Her fingers dug desperately into the expensive fabric of her skirt. "Are you?" she stammered, struggling to get the words out. Her eyes suddenly flashed with a sickening familiar glint of greed. Even in the midst of her total psychological collapse, her brain was still trying to calculate a way to benefit from the situation. She was already trying to figure out if there was a way to salvage this, if there was a way to flatter me and extract money from me, just like my father had tried to do earlier. "Are you a millionaire, Dominique?" I looked at the calculating greed swimming in her tear-filled eyes. I realized then that she would never change. She would never love me for who I was. She would only ever value the number attached to my name. It was the final, ultimate confirmation that walking away from this family was the only correct choice I could ever make. I slowly bent down, bending one knee until I was hovering just inches away from her face. I wanted her to hear me perfectly. I wanted to completely crush any lingering hope she had of ever touching a single dime of my money. I smiled a slow, chilling smile. I leaned in close to her ear, my voice dropping to a dangerously soft whisper. "No, mother," I said clearly, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "I am a franchise billionaire." The word billionaire hit my mother like a physical blow to the chest. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. The calculating, greedy light that had briefly sparked in her eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. Her brain simply could not process the magnitude of her own catastrophic failure. She had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable peasant, completely blind to the fact that I possessed the kind of generational wealth that she could only dream of seeing in movies. She slumped further down against the base of the fallen wooden dining chair, her designer silk dress pooling around her on the cold Italian marble floor. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer, and turned my attention back to the massive mahogany table. Preston was still standing there, paralyzed. His knuckles were completely white from gripping the edge of the table so tightly. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. I reached across the ruined Thanksgiving turkey, completely ignoring the dark gravy that had soaked into the pristine white linen tablecloth. I grabbed the edge of the heavy legal file that Preston was too terrified to hold, and I flipped the thick parchment paper to the next section. "There is one more document you need to review, Preston," I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity. "You see, being a landlord is not just about owning the deed, it is also about enforcing the terms of the lease. Look at the paper. Read the bold red letters stamped right at the top by the Fulton County Magistrate Court." Preston slowly lowered his eyes. He let out a ragged, desperate breath. Chloe, who was still weeping loudly into her hands, peeked through her fingers to look at the document. Right there, printed in stark, uncompromising black ink, was an official writ of possession. It was a formal court-ordered eviction notice. When you sign a lease for a premium luxury estate in Buckhead, the monthly rent is roughly $30,000, I explained, pacing slowly around the edge of the table, my designer heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. "It is a steep price, but you two were absolutely desperate to maintain your fake wealthy image. You wanted to convince our parents and your country club friends that you had finally arrived. But the problem with renting a lifestyle you cannot afford is that eventually the bill comes due." I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my sister. Chloe flinched visibly, shrinking back against her chair. "You have not paid your rent in 4 months, Chloe." I stated the truth, slicing through the air like a razor blade. $120,000 in arrears. For 16 weeks, you have been dodging phone calls from my property management team. You ignored the polite reminder emails. You ignored the formal certified warning letters sent to this very address. You actually believed that because Lux Haven LLC was a massive faceless corporate entity, you could somehow slip through the cracks. You thought you could just live here for free, hiding behind these iron gates, while you desperately tried to figure out how to avoid federal prison for your tax evasion and fraud. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He swallowed hard, looking frantically around the room as if hoping a hidden trapdoor would suddenly open and swallow him whole. "But I am not a faceless corporate entity?" I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly quiet register. "I am the woman you just called a maid. I am the woman you just threatened to physically drag out of this house. I watched every single one of your missed payments roll across my desk. I watched you default month after month, Most landlords would have just sent a standard collection agency to deal with you. But considering how much you both love to disrespect me, I decided to handle this particular account personally. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany table right next to the eviction notice. I personally walked into the courthouse, I told them, relishing the look of absolute terror spreading across their faces. I made sure my corporate attorneys filed every single piece of paperwork with absolute flawless precision. I paid the premium fees to expedite the hearing. I stood in front of the judge and presented your abysmal payment history. And on Tuesday morning, while you were out buying a frozen turkey with a maxed-out credit card, the judge signed the final eviction order. Chloe let out a loud, agonizing wail. She threw her upper body across the table, completely disregarding the spilled cranberry sauce. "No!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "No, Dominique, please. You cannot do this. You cannot kick us out. We have nowhere to go. Our accounts are frozen. We do not have any money for a hotel. My friends will not take us in if they know we are broke. Please, you are my sister. You cannot put us on the street." The sheer hypocrisy of her begging was breathtaking. Less than 10 minutes ago, she had been cheering for her husband to physically throw me out into the cold night. She had been eagerly waiting for the private security guards to slap handcuffs on my wrists and drag me away to a concrete jail cell. She had called me a psychotic, jealous loser who scrubbed toilets. And now, the second she realized I held the keys to her entire existence, she was weaponizing the very concept of family she had spent her whole life destroying. I looked at her tear-streaked face, her ruined makeup, and her desperate, clutching hands. "You stopped being my sister the night you watched me collapse in a hospital and refused to lend me $100 for my heart medication," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "You stopped being family when you sat at this table tonight and laughed while our mother called me a peasant. You do not get to use the word sister to save yourself from the consequences of your own financial crimes." Preston suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the table. "Listen to me, Dominique," he pleaded, completely abandoning his arrogant white privilege persona. He was now a desperate, broken man begging a black woman for mercy. "We can fix this. I have assets tied up in overseas accounts. Once the restructuring is complete, I can pay you back every single cent. With interest. Just give us a month. Give us a few weeks to figure this out. You cannot just throw us out right before the holidays. It is Thanksgiving." I stood up straight, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked at Preston with a mixture of disgust and profound pity. "I am not a charity, Preston," I said coldly. "I am a business owner. And you are a liability. Your federal indictment for defrauding your investors is going to be public knowledge by Monday morning. I have absolutely no intention of letting my premium real estate be swarmed by FBI agents and news vans when they finally come to arrest you. You are a toxic asset, and I am liquidating you from my portfolio." Pastor Thomas and Aunt Denise were completely silent, pressed against the far wall. They were witnessing the absolute dismantling of everything they thought they knew about this family. They were watching the golden child and her perfect husband be reduced to begging squatters. My father, Derek, was still sitting in his chair, staring blankly at his cold food, completely broken by the realization that he had bet on the wrong horse his entire life. I reached out and tapped the crystal face of my Cartier watch. The sharp, rhythmic ticking sound echoed in the quiet room, perfectly matching the beating of my own calm, steady heart. "The security team you so graciously called to the property is waiting right outside at the end of the driveway," I announced, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "Captain Davis has a copy of this exact court order. He knows exactly who the legal owner of this estate is, and he knows exactly who is currently trespassing." I picked up my designer handbag and draped the leather strap over my shoulder. I looked at Preston and Chloe, taking in their ruined clothes, their terrified faces, and the absolute destruction of their fake empire. "You have exactly 48 hours to clear your garbage out of my property," I declared, my voice ringing loud and clear through the grand dining room. "You will pack your clothes, your fake designer bags, and you will leave. If you attempt to steal any of the furniture, appliances, or fixtures that belong to this house, Captain Davis has my strict authorization to have you both arrested for grand larceny." I turned my back on them, taking one step toward the grand marble foyer, before stopping and looking over my shoulder one last time. "The countdown starts right now." I watched the words hang in the air, suspended in the heavy silence of the ruined Thanksgiving dinner. The countdown had officially begun. For a few agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Then the survival instincts of a family bred on toxic opportunism violently kicked in. My mother Vivian was still sitting on the Italian marble floor, her designer silk dress bunched up around her waist. She looked at the heavy legal file resting on the destroyed turkey, and then she looked at Chloe. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying to witness. The unconditional maternal love she had supposedly harbored for her golden child evaporated into thin air the exact moment she realized the gold was completely fake. Vivian scrambled to her feet, using the edge of the mahogany table to pull herself up. She did not look at me. She marched straight toward Chloe, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You lied to us!" Vivian shrieked, her voice completely devoid of the sweet affection she had used just an hour ago. "You dragged us into this mess. You paraded around in your expensive clothes, acting like you were better than everyone else while you were nothing but a broke, pathetic parasite living off your sister's hard work. You are dragging this entire family down into the gutter with you." Chloe recoiled as if she had just been slapped. "Mom," she sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand. "Mom, it is me. It is Chloe. You cannot turn on me like this." "Do not touch me," Vivian spat, slapping Chloe's hand away with brutal force. "You are an absolute embarrassment. I bragged about you to my entire congregation. I told everyone you were a brilliant, successful doctor. How am I supposed to show my face at church on Sunday, knowing my daughter is a tax-evading criminal getting evicted from a house she cannot even afford to rent? You are dead weight, Chloe. You are nothing but a massive disappointment." Watching my mother verbally slaughter her favorite daughter was a masterclass in hypocrisy. For 35 years, Chloe had believed she was loved for who she was. In exactly 30 seconds, she learned the brutal truth that I had known my entire life. In this family, love was a transaction, and Chloe's credit card had just been violently declined. My father Derek, who had spent the entire evening hiding in his chair, suddenly found his courage. He realized that the true center of power in the room was no longer the arrogant white Wall Street titan. The power belonged entirely to the black woman he had ignored for over a decade. Derek stood up aggressively, pointing a thick finger directly at Preston. "And you," he barked, his voice booming with fake patriarchal authority. "You come into our family pretending to be some elite financial genius. You sat at my table eating my food, talking down to my flesh and blood, while you are nothing but a useless, unemployed fraud. You are a terrible husband and a pathetic excuse for a man. You could not even provide a roof over my daughter's head without stealing it from her own sister." Preston was completely backed into a corner. His own wife was weeping hysterically. His mother-in-law was screaming, and his father-in-law was tearing his fake masculinity to shreds. The solid, unified front that had bullied me all evening was completely cannibalizing itself right in front of my eyes. They were tearing each other apart like starving animals fighting over the last scrap of meat. Aunt Denise, seeing the violent shifting of the tides, decided it was time to secure her own survival. She smoothed the front of her blouse, adjusted her large church hat, and plastered on the most sickeningly sweet fake smile I had ever seen. She completely abandoned the condescending tone she had used when she ordered me to fetch the gravy. "Well, I always knew you were a brilliant girl, Dominique." Aunt Denise cooed, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She took a cautious step toward me, clasping her hands together in front of her chest. "I always told your mother that your cleaning business was going to blossom into something magnificent. The Lord clearly blessed you with an incredible mind for real estate. We are all just so incredibly proud of the woman you have become." I stared at her, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. The sheer audacity of these people was truly staggering. They possessed no loyalty, no morals, and absolutely no shame. They would gladly bow to whoever held the thickest wallet. Derek pushed past Preston and walked quickly around the table, stepping over the spilled cranberry sauce on the floor. He approached me with a look of desperate, frantic hope shining in his eyes. He actually believed that because we shared the same DNA, I was going to simply forget the decades of abuse and welcome him into my billion-dollar empire. He reached out and grabbed both of my hands. His palms were sweaty and his grip was uncomfortably tight. I looked down at his hands, completely repulsed, but I did not pull away immediately. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of delusional fantasy he was about to propose. Dominique, sweetheart. Derek pleaded, his voice thick with fake emotion. Please forgive us. We were blinded by their lies. We had no idea what they were doing to you behind our backs. We are your parents. We love you. We have always loved you. He squeezed my hands tighter, leaning in close. Listen to me, he whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward the sobbing figures of Chloe and Preston. We will help you pack their bags right now. We will throw those two useless parasites out onto the street tonight. You do not even need to wait 48 hours. We will handle the trash for you, and from now on, it will just be us. Just you, me, and your mother living in this beautiful house together as a real family. Just like it was always meant to be. Does that sound good, sweetheart? I violently yanked my hands out of his grasp. The physical contact made my skin actually crawl. I took a large, deliberate step back, wiping my palms against the fabric of my tailored blazer, as if I had just touched a piece of rotting garbage. Does that sound good? I repeated, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that sent a visible shiver down his spine. I looked at the man who had completely ignored my existence for over a decade. He was standing there with his shoulders hunched, offering me a pathetic, hopeful smile, while the scent of spilled gravy and ruined cranberry sauce filled the air between us. You stand there surrounded by the absolute wreckage of your favorite daughter's life, and your very first instinct is to immediately attach yourself to a new host. You are nothing but a parasite, Derek. My father physically recoiled, as if I had struck him. His fake, desperate smile melted into a look of absolute shame, but I was not finished. I wanted to systematically dismantle every single delusion they still held about our relationship. You do not love me. I stated the truth, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. Do not ever insult my intelligence by using that word. You did not want to be a family when I was a struggling 20-year-old girl begging for help to pay my medical bills. You did not want to be a family 10 minutes ago when you sat in that chair and watched your wife slap me across the face. You did not want to be a family when I was just the maid. You only want to play the role of the loving father now because you just found out the maid holds the deed to a $3 million mansion and a billion-dollar corporate portfolio. Derek opened his mouth, his hands trembling, but he could not find a single word to defend himself. There was no defense. The raw, naked truth was completely undeniable. I turned my gaze down to Vivian, who was still sitting slumped on the Italian marble floor. She looked up at me, her makeup completely ruined, her eyes wide and hollow. You spent my entire life making me feel like I was completely worthless, I told her, my voice steady and devoid of any lingering pain. You made sure I knew that my dark skin, my natural hair, and my choice to work with my hands made me inferior to Chloe. You built a shrine to her superficial accomplishments, and you demanded that I worship at it. For years, I laid awake in my tiny apartment wondering what was wrong with me. I wondered why I was never smart enough or graceful enough to earn a seat at your table. I broke my own back trying to win your conditional approval. I gestured toward Chloe, who was now sobbing quietly into her napkin, completely broken by the reality of her impending federal indictment and homelessness. You gave her everything, I continued. You gave her my college fund, you gave her your praise, and you gave her a golden pedestal. And look exactly at what she did with it. She built a life of absolute fraud. She built a house of cards that collapsed the second the wind blew. You worshipped a lie, Vivian. You sacrificed your actual daughter for an illusion. Aunt Denise tried to subtly step backward toward the hallway, hoping to disappear into the shadows, but I locked eyes with her, pinning her exactly where she stood. "And you," I said, addressing my aunt and Pastor Thomas, who was staring firmly at his shoes. "You sit at these holiday dinners eating the food and passing judgment. You use your religion as a weapon to enforce a toxic hierarchy. You smile in my face and whisper behind my back. You are all entirely complicit in this sickness." I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of absolute emancipation wash over my entire body. The heavy, invisible chains of familial obligation that had weighed me down for 35 years completely shattered. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt entirely free. "The greatest thing you ever did for me was rejecting me," I announced, looking at all of them. "When you threw me away, you forced me to build my own table. You forced me to learn how to survive in a world that is completely unforgiving. I learned how to negotiate, how to acquire assets, and how to build an empire out of the rubble of your rejection. Every single time you called me a maid, you just threw another log onto the fire of my ambition." I stood incredibly tall. The bright light of the crystal chandelier caught the red swelling bruise on my cheek, but I wore it like a badge of absolute honor. It was the physical proof that I had survived their worst attack and emerged completely victorious. "I do not need your fake apologies," I declared, my voice ringing with the uncompromising power of a woman who had entirely healed herself. "I do not need your empty promises to change. I do not need your toxic conditional love. I am completely whole without you. I have built a family of friends, colleagues, and mentors who actually value my character and not just my bank account." I looked directly at Derek, who was weeping silently, his tears falling onto his expensive tie. "So no, Derek," I said, finalizing the absolute severance of our bloodline. "We are not going to live together as a real family. You are going to walk out of those front doors with the rest of them. You are going to go back to your own house, and you are going to live with the profound knowledge that you completely destroyed your relationship with the only person who could have actually saved you. And you will never contact me again. I am entirely cutting the rotting branch of this family tree out of my life permanently." The absolute finality of my words hung in the air. There was no room for debate. There was no room for negotiation. The trial was completely over, and the verdict had been delivered. I turned my back on them, completely dismissing their existence. I looked toward the grand marble foyer where the heavy wooden double doors were still closed. I raised my voice, ensuring that it carried clearly into the hallway. "Captain Davis," I called out. Instantly, one of the heavy doors swung open. Captain Davis stepped back into the grand entryway, his imposing figure framed by the flashing yellow and white emergency lights from the patrol vehicles outside. He stood at perfect military attention, his hands resting on his utility belt, waiting for my final instructions. I walked slowly toward the foyer, stopping right at the edge of the dining room archway. I did not look back at my family. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the professional security officer standing before me. "Captain Davis, I have officially informed the occupants that their lease is terminated and their eviction is effective immediately." I said, my tone crisp and authoritative. "They have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. My property management team will arrive on Saturday morning to conduct a full inventory inspection." "Understood," Boss Captain Davis replied, his deep voice echoing in the quiet house. "We will maintain a stationary patrol unit at the end of the driveway to monitor their departure." I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Ensure they do not take any belongings that belong to the house when they leave," I commanded loud enough for everyone in the dining room to hear. "Check their bags if you have to. If they attempt to remove any fixtures, appliances, or furniture, or if they resist the eviction process in any way whatsoever, do not hesitate. Just call the police." As soon as I gave Captain Davis that final uncompromising order, the fragile, invisible dam holding back the reality of the dining room completely shattered. I did not turn my head to look back at them, but I did not need to see their faces to know exactly what was happening. The auditory landscape of their absolute destruction painted a vivid enough picture behind me. Chloe let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was not a cry or a sob. It was a guttural, hyperventilating gasp of pure primal terror. She sounded like a drowning victim desperately clawing her way to the surface of the water, only to realize there was no oxygen left to breathe. Her perfect fake life, her country club aspirations, her designer wardrobe, and her stolen mansion were all actively burning to the ground around her. She began to wail loudly, her voice tearing at the vocal cords echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the estate. She was begging my parents, begging Preston, and begging God to somehow reverse the hands of time. Then came the violent sound of Preston's absolute mental collapse. I heard the distinct sharp crash of heavy crystal shattering against the Italian marble floor. He had clearly grabbed one of the expensive wine glasses from the table and hurled it against the wall in a fit of impotent rage. He began screaming a string of vicious, panicked profanities. His deep, booming voice was stripped of all its unearned arrogance and white privilege. He was no longer the powerful Wall Street titan dictating orders to the hired help. He was a terrified, cornered fraud screaming at the top of his lungs because he finally realized that his money was gone, his status was an illusion, and federal prison was waiting for him on Monday morning. He cursed Chloe for lying to him. He cursed my parents for not having the money to bail them out. And he cursed me for being the architect of his ultimate downfall. Beneath the chaotic symphony of my sister wailing and her husband destroying the dining room, I could hear the pathetic, agonizing moans of my mother. Vivian was still sitting on the floor, weeping hysterically. She was chanting my name over and over again, interspersed with desperate pleas for someone to help her up. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her social standing. She knew that by tomorrow morning, the entire church congregation would know that her golden child was a broke squatter and her hated daughter was the billionaire landlord who evicted them. The shame was going to consume her alive. My father Derek was shouting over all of them, trying to assert some kind of pathetic control over a situation that had slipped entirely through his fingers. It was a chorus of absolute misery. It was the sound of toxic people finally colliding with the brutal, unforgiving wall of consequences. For 35 years, I had allowed their voices to dictate my self-worth. I had internalized their insults, their mockery, and their conditional love. I had let their words convince me that I was nothing more than a common maid, meant to clean up the messes they left behind. But as I stood in the grand marble foyer listening to them tear each other apart like starving wolves, I realized that their voices held absolutely no power over me anymore. They were just empty, hollow sounds echoing in a house that belonged to me. I did not pause my stride. I did not look over my shoulder. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the heavy mahogany double doors leading out to the front porch. Officer Hayes, the younger security guard standing near the entrance, anticipated my movement. He stepped forward, reaching out to grasp the heavy brass handle. He pulled the massive door wide open, holding it respectfully for me to pass through. "Thank you, Officer Hayes," I said, my voice perfectly calm, completely contrasting the frantic screaming happening just 30 feet behind me. "Have a good night, boss," he replied, offering a crisp, professional nod. I stepped over the threshold and walked out onto the grand stone porch of the $3 million estate. Officer Hayes pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The heavy thud of the door closing was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It acted like a massive physical vault, sealing shut, instantly muting the screaming, the crying, and the crashing crystal inside. The silence that washed over me was immediate and profoundly deep. I stood at the top of the stone steps and closed my eyes. The freezing November night air hit my face like a physical wave. The temperature in Atlanta had dropped significantly since the afternoon, and the wind was biting and sharp. It whipped against my bare cheeks, stinging the swollen red welt my mother had left on my face just moments ago. But I did not flinch. I welcomed the biting cold. I welcomed the sting. It grounded me entirely in the present moment. I took a slow, incredibly deep breath, drawing the crisp autumn air deep into my lungs. For decades, I had been suffocating. I had been breathing in the stale, toxic expectations of a family that actively wanted to see me fail. I had been choking on their jealousy, their manipulation, and their relentless emotional abuse. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself down, making myself small and invisible, just so they could feel tall. But as I exhaled the cold air into the dark night, I felt the invisible crushing weight completely lift off my shoulders. The heavy chains of familial obligation, the desperate childhood need for parental validation, and the trauma bond that had tied me to their dysfunction all snapped simultaneously. The girl who used to cry herself to sleep, wishing she was good enough for her parents, was officially dead. The woman standing on the porch was untouchable. She was a self-made titan, an empire builder, and a survivor. I opened my eyes and looked out over the massive manicured lawn of the property. The flashing yellow and white emergency lights from the Buckhead Estate's security vehicles illuminated the dark landscaping, casting long, sweeping shadows across the expensive imported oak trees. I looked at the sleek luxury cars parked in the circular driveway. There was Chloe's pristine white Range Rover and Preston's aggressive black Porsche. They were beautiful, expensive machines that were undoubtedly leased or heavily financed, and they would both likely be repossessed by the bank before the end of the month. They were just more fake props in a play that had just been permanently canceled. I adjusted the strap of my Hermes Birkin bag on my shoulder, feeling the reassuring weight of the legal documents safely tucked inside. I began to walk slowly down the wide stone steps, my designer heels clicking sharply against the concrete. Captain Davis emerged from the shadows near one of the patrol vehicles. He walked alongside me, maintaining a respectful professional distance as he escorted me down the long, winding gravel driveway toward the main exit of the estate. He did not ask any questions about the screaming he had heard inside. He did not offer any unnecessary commentary. He was a man who understood the absolute necessity of discretion when dealing with high-net-worth individuals. "We will have a unit stationed at the front gates around the clock." Boss Captain Davis stated, his voice low and steady, breaking the quiet of the night. "If they attempt to cause any damage to the interior of the property before the 48-hour deadline expires, my men will intervene immediately and detain them for local law enforcement." "I appreciate your diligence, Captain," I replied, keeping my gaze focused straight ahead on the dark road leading out of the neighborhood. "Make sure your team logs every single item they load into their vehicles. They are desperate people, and desperate people tend to steal whatever they can get their hands on when the ship goes down." "Consider it done," he assured me. We reached the end of the long driveway, stepping past the towering wrought iron gates that marked the property line of Lux Haven LLC. I was officially standing on the public street outside the boundaries of the estate I had just reclaimed. Captain Davis stopped at the edge of the property line, touching 2 fingers to the brim of his uniform cap in a final gesture of respect before turning back to join his men. I stood alone on the quiet, dimly lit street of the affluent Buckhead neighborhood. The sprawling mansions around me were completely silent, their wealthy occupants blissfully unaware of the absolute financial massacre that had just occurred down the street. The crisp wind rustled the dry autumn leaves on the pavement. I was completely alone, but for the very first time in my 35 years of life, I did not feel lonely. I felt an incredible surging sense of absolute power and total autonomy. I had faced the monsters of my past. I had looked them dead in the eye, and I had completely dismantled them, using nothing but the undeniable truth and the staggering weight of my own success. I had taken the bricks they threw at me and built an impenetrable fortress. Suddenly, the deep quiet of the affluent street was broken by the low, powerful hum of an incredibly expensive engine. Out of the pitch-black shadows further down the street, a pair of brilliant, piercing LED headlights flared to life. The beams cut through the freezing November darkness, illuminating the fallen autumn leaves dancing across the asphalt. The vehicle rolled forward with the smooth, silent grace of a predatory cat stalking through the night. It was a massive, sleek black Mercedes Maybach, pristine and polished to a mirror shine. It glided effortlessly up to the curb, coming to a perfectly smooth stop exactly 2 feet in front of where I was standing. The engine idled quietly, a testament to its supreme German engineering. Immediately, the heavy driver's side door opened. A tall, sharply dressed man in a flawless, dark-tailored suit stepped out into the cold night. It was Elias, my private personal chauffeur, and the head of my executive protection detail. He was a man who had been with me since the very early days of Luxhaven Estates, a loyal employee who respected the empire I had built because he had watched me build it with my own 2 hands. Elias walked briskly around the front of the massive luxury vehicle. He did not ask how my Thanksgiving dinner went. He took one look at my perfectly calm posture and the faint swelling bruise on my cheek, and he understood immediately that a war had been fought and won. He reached out and pulled the heavy rear passenger door open wide, revealing the warm, pristine, ambient-lit interior of the Maybach. "Good evening, Miss Dominique," Elia said, his voice carrying the deep, respectful tone of a man addressing royalty. I looked at the open door, the plush leather seats, and the quiet sanctuary waiting for me inside. I took one final look back at the $3 million mansion sitting in the distance, its windows glowing against the dark night, holding the broken remnants of a family I would never speak to again. "Good evening, Elias," I replied, a genuine, relaxed smile finally spreading across my face. "Take me home." The heavy doors of the Maybach closed with a soft, solid thud, instantly sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary of premium leather and perfect climate control. As Elias navigated the massive vehicle away from the affluent Buckhead neighborhood, I leaned back against the heated seat and watched the sprawling estates blur past my tinted window. The sharp, stinging pain on my cheek where my mother had struck me was already beginning to fade, replaced by a profound sense of absolute peace. For the first time in my 35 years of existence, I was not carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I was not plotting how to earn their love or worrying about how my career choices would reflect on their fragile social standing. I was simply breathing. I watched the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta come into view, illuminating the dark November sky, and I knew with absolute certainty that the hardest chapter of my life had just permanently closed. The fallout from that Thanksgiving dinner was swift, brutal, and entirely publicly documented. Exactly 48 hours after I walked out of that $3 million mansion, Captain Davis sent me a highly detailed security report accompanied by date-stamped photographs. Chloe and Preston did not leave with the dignity of wealthy homeowners. They left like frantic scavengers. Because their bank accounts were already frozen, they could not even afford to hire a professional moving company. They had to rent a cheap, battered moving truck. The photographs showed my sister, the supposedly brilliant and flawless dermatologist, carrying her clothes out of the house in black plastic trash bags, because the bank had already repossessed her matching set of designer Louis Vuitton luggage. Preston looked like a broken man sweating through his clothes as he awkwardly shoved their remaining cheap furniture into the back of the rental truck under the stern, watchful eyes of my armed security team. They left the property exactly as they had entered it, completely bankrupt and drowning in their own lies. Their real nightmare, however, began on Monday morning. Just as I had predicted, the federal indictment against Preston dropped with the destructive force of a massive bomb. Federal agents raided his leased office space, carrying out boxes of evidence and hard drives. The news stations in Atlanta picked up the story, immediately flashing Preston's arrogant face across the morning broadcast, labeling him as the mastermind behind a multi-million-dollar private equity fraud scheme. He was arrested without bail. The sheer public humiliation of having her husband paraded in handcuffs on local television completely shattered whatever remained of Chloe's fragile sanity. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to distance herself from his crimes and save her own sinking reputation, She filed for divorce by Wednesday afternoon. But it was far too late. The Internal Revenue Service officially auctioned off her medical equipment to cover her massive tax debts, and her medical license was suspended pending a state board investigation into her fraudulent billing practices. The golden child, the brilliant doctor who was supposed to elevate our family name, was suddenly a divorced, unemployed felon sleeping on a cheap mattress in a rented studio apartment. My parents, of course, refused to accept any accountability for the monsters they had created or the daughter they had abused. In her desperate need to control the narrative and play the ultimate victim, my mother, Vivian took her grievances to the internet. She logged onto Facebook and wrote incredibly long, tearful paragraphs about how she had sacrificed everything for her children, only to be abandoned by her wealthy billionaire daughter in her old age. She posted old pictures of us attempting to paint me as a cruel, heartless corporate monster who threw her own sister out onto the street during the holidays. She expected the internet to rally behind her. She expected her church congregation to shower her with sympathy and righteous anger on her behalf. But the internet is absolutely undefeated when it comes to uncovering the truth. It took exactly 2 hours for a savvy local journalist to connect the dots between my mother's crying posts, Preston's highly publicized federal fraud arrest, and the public tax seizure of Chloe's clinic. The journalist published a scathing article detailing the exact financial ruin of the Hayes family, exposing the fact that they had been illegally squatting in a luxury property. The comment section under my mother's Facebook post turned into an absolute bloodbath. Instead of receiving sympathy, she was relentlessly mocked and dragged for enabling a family of frauds. The public embarrassment was so severe that Pastor Thomas formally asked my parents to step down from all their leadership positions within the church. He politely suggested that they needed to take an extended leave of absence to focus on their family issues. They were entirely excommunicated from the high society social circles they had spent decades worshiping. They were left completely isolated, trapped in their fading middle-class home, with nothing but their bitterness and the crushing realization that they had bet their entire lives on the wrong daughter. I did not read the articles. I did not check my mother's social media pages. I simply deleted their contact information from my phone and continued building my empire. On that Thanksgiving night, while my biological family was tearing each other apart in a ruined dining room, Elias drove me straight to my actual home. It was not a rented mansion in Buckhead. It was a massive, ultra-modern penthouse sitting on the top floor of a luxury high-rise that I had developed and owned outright in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. The private elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, where I was immediately enveloped by the rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasted duck garlic, herb mashed potatoes, and warm baked cinnamon apples. I walked into my expansive living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city, and was greeted by a chorus of genuine cheering and laughter. This was my chosen family. These were the people who actually mattered. Sitting around my massive custom dining table was Sarah, my very first employee, who had started out scrubbing floors with me, and was now the regional vice president of Lux Haven Estates. Next to her was Marcus, my brilliant corporate attorney, who had helped me navigate the ruthless world of commercial real estate acquisitions. There were mentors, friends, and colleagues who had stood by me when I had nothing but a bucket, a mop, and a dream. Elias took off his driving coat and took his rightful seat at the head of the table right next to me. There was no fake crystal. There was no forced religious posturing. There were no underlying threats or toxic microaggressions. There was only warm food, pouring wine, and the incredibly loud, joyful sound of people who genuinely loved and respected one another. We clinked our glasses together, toasting to loyalty, to hard work, and to the family we had consciously chosen to build. Sitting there, surrounded by authentic love, I realized that the slap my mother had given me earlier that evening was not a curse. It was a liberation. The greatest freedom a person can ever achieve comes from completely owning your own story. You have to own the painful chapters, the humiliating moments, and the triumphant victories, all with the exact same level of pride. The path to building an empire is never just about acquiring capital. It is about acquiring the emotional intelligence to recognize who deserves a seat at your table and who needs to be permanently evicted from your life. The transformation is an ongoing daily choice to live firmly in your own reality rather than shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's pathetic illusion. Standing here today looking out over the city I helped build, I can honestly say I would not change a single thing about what happened that night. Every single loss I experienced created the necessary space for something far more genuine and powerful to grow in its place. Have you ever experienced a moment when losing what you thought you needed actually led to gaining exactly what you truly deserved? Have you ever realized that being rejected by toxic family members was actually the greatest gift the universe could have ever given you? I would absolutely love to hear your stories of unexpected transformation and ultimate revenge in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more authentic stories of resilience, survival, and massive success. And if you know someone who is currently struggling with a toxic family dynamic, share this video with them right now as a reminder that their current situation is not their final destination. Thank you so much for watching and being a part of my journey today. And please always remember, your story is still being written with every single plot twist. Never let anyone price your worth by the broom you hold, because who knows, you might just be the one who owns the entire building.